Well, good evening. I'm Graham Allison, the director of the Center for Science and International Affairs. We're still waiting for Sandy Spector, who's en route from the airport, we think. But we're going to begin anyhow, since in the Harvard Rules classes begin at the latest 10 minutes after the appointed hour, and with the rain tonight, I think we took a little grace, so we apologize for that. 32 years ago, in 1963, President John Kennedy made a hard-headed but gloomy prediction. He said that by the end of the 1970s, he foresaw that the world would have some 25 nuclear weapon states. That prediction reflected the prevailing judgment among experts at the time. A prevailing judgment that said that as states acquired the technical capability to separate highly enriched uranium and plutonium, they would acquire nuclear arsenals, as indeed had the states to that point. The US, then the Soviet Union, the UK, France, and in 1963, China on the way. I remember, actually, I was a student at that time, and I remember the prevailing expectation, and indeed personally remember the expectation that nuclear war was a likelihood, more likely than not. Indeed, it was just a year earlier, in 1962, a year earlier than Kennedy's prediction, that we had seen the Cuban Missile Crisis, an event in which Kennedy expected that the odds were about 1 in 3 that it would end in war. It's a testimony, I think, to wise and vigorous policy that Kennedy's forecast was, by his efforts and those of many successive presidents and administrations, falsified. The impulse that came out of the Cuban Missile Crisis led in the Kennedy administration to the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, and then set in motion a course of action which then eventually became the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and then SALT and START, and a successive number of treaties that bring us to this occasion. So it's actually quite appropriate and fitting that on this, which is now the 25th anniversary of the signing of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was the principal international agreement establishing the framework that has helped inhibit and prohibit the accomplishment of the prediction that John Kennedy had offered, that we take an occasion to stop and look back a little bit, but even more importantly, to look forward. When the Non-Proliferation Treaty was signed 25 years ago, it was agreed that after it went into force, it would be operational for 25 years, at the conclusion of which it would lapse unless it was renewed or extended. And the treaty left open the form of the renewal or extension, which is actually one of the central policy issues on the table today. Just a month from now, in New York at the United Nations, representatives of more than 170 countries will gather to discuss whether to extend the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and if so, for how long, and with what conditions. After too many months of dithering, the American administration under President Clinton has now finally become seized of the issue in the last several months, and indeed has stated its unequivocal position and given its full support for unconditional, unlimited extension of the treaty. That is, for the renewal of the treaty for an unlimited time period without conditions. when Secretary of State Christopher was here at the school just a month and a couple of weeks ago, back at the end of January, offering his speech. If those of you who were there will remember, he said, the number one priority for the Clinton administration in our foreign policy in the year ahead will be non-proliferation, and at the top of that list is the unlimited and unconditional extension of the NPT. Hello. There you go.
Excellent timing.
We're just concluding the ad-libbing. This is like the vaudeville act that comes as a little juggling before the striptease begins, or whatever Sandy has in store for us.
Don't get their hopes up.
The Christopher's proposition that the Non-Proliferation Treaty would be, and the non-proliferation regime at the top of the administration's agenda, is the same message that President Clinton offered in a speech I heard in Washington last week. Single, central, most important focus, what President Clinton called the year of decision for non-proliferation, in which the NPT is at the head of it. So to discuss this subject tonight, we now have two excellent panelists. And I guess we go back to our normal schedule, or what would you like to get? Randy, what's your pleasure?
He's going to go
Okay. Our first speaker, who has recently arrived, is Sandy Spector. Leonard Spector has been active in the nuclear nonproliferation field for more than 15 years, working first at the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and later as chief counsel to the Senate Energy and Nuclear Proliferation Subcommittee. While he was at the subcommittee, Sandy assisted in the drafting of the 1978 Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act, which is the basic act that we're discussing today. Mr. Spector joined the Roosevelt Center for American Policy Studies in 1983 as a senior fellow, and has since 1984 been a senior associate of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington and director of that program for nuclear non-proliferation. He's a frequent commentator on this subject and has been very actively involved in this recent debate. So we'll have first some comments from Sandy, and then I'll introduce Randy.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I can say that in many different ways. I guess the planes were a little late on account of the weather. I suppose in Washington there's sort of a reputation for being a bit glib. And not to disappoint, I thought I might try to develop a very easy-to-remember answer to the basic question that's being discussed this evening, which is whether or not nuclear proliferation can be capped. In fact, I thought I was able to distill my remarks into a single word, and although it may sound a little facetious, I hope you'll see that it is not entirely. So the answer to the question of can nuclear proliferation be capped is maybe. The maybe comes because, on the one hand, we have some very successful efforts to use the traditional tools to address the traditional non-proliferation problems, or proliferation problems. And on the other side, we are facing a very serious new threat that really threatens the entire enterprise in many respects. So what I thought I would do this evening is to try to discuss with you the rather astonishing accomplishments that we have experienced in the last few years in terms of curbing the spread of nuclear arms and actually reversing the spread in some cases, and then turn to the question which really, as I say, is so threatening, and that's the danger that we're seeing from the breakup of the former Soviet Union, and particularly the problem of loss of control over nuclear materials in Russia. If you take a look at the traditional list of countries of proliferation concern and compare where we are today to where we were just a few years ago, it's rather astonishing how the list of countries of concern has shrunken. We have the truly extraordinary instance of a country renouncing nuclear weapons after acquiring them. This is the case of South Africa, which acquired 6 nuclear weapons during the 1980s, and then as part of the transition under Nelson Mandela, anticipating Nelson Mandela's coming to power and the other changes in the region, abandoned those weapons, and I think did so convincingly, persuading all outsiders that the nuclear material that was obtained for these weapons is now under inspection and that the weapons enterprise has been dismantled. We've had Argentina and Brazil, which for decades resisted comprehensive inspections on their nuclear programs, and at least Brazil acknowledging that it did have a nuclear weapons effort, finally accepting full inspections, bilateral inspections, as well as those of the International Atomic Energy Agency. There's a country that many of you probably haven't thought about, but it's my understanding it also had a nuclear weapons program until the change of regime in 1989, I believe it was, and that was Romania. The Ceausescu government apparently was pursuing nuclear arms to a certain degree. We don't know all the details, but when the governments changed, that too ended, and we had a situation where convincingly we believe this country is now developing nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, but not for nuclear arms. Iraq is a fifth country, which I think we got lucky, to say the least. We learned about what it was doing as a result of the Gulf War, and we have put that country under very, very strict international monitoring. Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine were three other countries that certainly had the opportunity to think about going nuclear, or to have resisted efforts to bring those nuclear weapons off of their territory back to Russia. And all of them, now including Ukraine, have agreed to accept comprehensive inspections and to transfer these weapons to Russia. And if you remember back in 1993, there were all these statements by Ukrainian officials and Ukrainian parliamentarians about the desirability of retaining these weapons. So the Ukrainian case was not an easy one, but as a result of international diplomacy led by the United States and the workings of the sort of global norm against proliferation, Ukraine was brought around, and I'll want to speak about that again later. North Korea is another case which I think is a success story, but I certainly would agree we have to put a question mark in parentheses after that. But for the moment at least, what looked like a very dangerous nuclear program now seems to be under control, and we have, if nothing else, breathing space. If this agreement that we've entered into with the North Koreans is fully implemented, we will really have a rollback of that program as well. So here were 9 cases, it's quite a list, of true accomplishment in terms of preventing proliferation from occurring or holding it in check or rolling it back. And I think that's quite a singular list. A few years ago, nobody could have come here and said that. We would have all been wringing our hands about at least half of these cases. Now, there are still obviously a certain number of problems. Israel, India, and Pakistan still possess nuclear capabilities. They could go to war and use nuclear weapons, no one doubts that. And we have considerable tensions, certainly in South Asia, if not also in the Middle East. So this is certainly an issue of concern. And Iran remains on the list, although it's a good sort of paradigm of where we are today. In terms of traditional efforts to get the bomb, we know they're out there trying and they're not making any progress. The real danger lies in whether they could jump ahead by getting material from Russia. Now, I think what's important here is not only the individual victories that we've achieved, and by we I mean the international community led by the United States by and large. Not only the individual victories that we've achieved, but I think we're also seeing the operation of some larger trends, and I think they're worth noting. Around the world, we're seeing increasing embrace of democratization, movement toward freer markets, a fear of isolation from the Western economy, which I think is a very intense factor in the decisions of a number of these states, and a desire to be integrated into the Western economy. Now, we know that that played a very, very big role in Ukraine's thinking about its nuclear future. It clearly also played a very important role in the readiness of North Korea, at least to move part way, and I would say a good way, toward denuclearization. And this is a trend which is going to be with us, I hope, for a long time to come. So while there are naysayers that you may be reading about in Foreign Affairs or in the New York Times Magazine section who say, oh, the spread of the bomb is inevitable, I think not only do we have a whole list of successes on the one hand, but we have these larger trends that are at work. Another such trend, I'd say, is the end of the Cold War, which enables us really to devote ourselves to addressing non-proliferation concerns when we have a particular country that we're worried about, without the fear that by pressing too hard we will push this country toward the Soviet Union or somehow emasculate it in its efforts to maintain autonomy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. And of course, Pakistan was a case in point where we had to pull back because we couldn't press Pakistan as hard as we might have since we needed it as an ally in the Afghan war against the Soviet forces that were there in Afghanistan. So I think that trend also is a favorable trend, and it's going to be with us. A second positive area where we've seen, or maybe this is now a third, it's the individual victories, these bigger trends, and another major trend is the way that the non-proliferation regime itself, these international treaties and inspections and so forth, are kind of gelling and forming a more substantial element in the way countries think about their nuclear futures. We've seen, for example, after the debacle in Iraq, that the International Atomic Energy Agency inspections have been greatly strengthened. Problem in Iraq was they had undeclared nuclear facilities, and at the time the agency only examined declared facilities. Now that has changed. Now the agency goes after undeclared sites, and they have pressed North Korea, and they will get access to those sites eventually, not as rapidly as we would all like. But the very fact that they went after the sites, that the North Koreans said no, these are undeclared sites, that it went to the UN, that a threat of economic sanctions emerged, I think contributed to the readiness of the North Koreans to eventually strike a deal with us. So even in that case, where we didn't get the actual inspections, the fact that we had the authority to go for them, the agency did, I think demonstrated that it is a much more forceful organization than it was only a few years back. And this brings me to the other major part of the regime that I won't have too much time to speak about, but we really should come back to, and that's the Non-Proliferation Treaty. As Graham, I gather, was saying, the treaty comes up for renewal, or extension, I should say, in a month from now, on the 17th of April. It really is quite extraordinary. It has 172 participants out of 184 countries that are members of the UN, so it is nearly universal. And some of the holdouts, like Brazil and Chile, are expected to join, as is Cuba, if not before the NPT extension conference, perhaps soon afterwards. 3 countries remain outside, India, Pakistan, and Israel. They retain the legal authority to build the bomb if they want to. But I think even in those cases, the norm helps to hold them in check. It contributes to why they're not testing nuclear weapons, why they're not declaring that they have nuclear weapons, and so forth. Now, very briefly, at the extension conference that comes up a month from now, the parties will have to decide among 3 options: an indefinite extension of the treaty, which is the U.S. position, what we want, an extension of the treaty for a single period or for a series of periods. And this will be debated at some length. It will be decided by majority vote, which is unusual for these international fora, which usually like to operate by consensus. So in effect, we, the United States, if we're going to prevail and get indefinite extension, will have to get a majority of, I think it's 86 at this point. There are a number of controversies. The principal one has to do with whether, under the treaty, the United States has lived up to its obligations, along with the other nuclear weapon states, to move toward nuclear disarmament. This is a very brief overview. The treaty, as you know, says that 5 countries are allowed to keep the bomb indefinitely: the United States, the Soviet Union, now Russia, Britain, France, and China, because they had tested the nuclear device before 1967. Everybody else who joins has to renounce nuclear weapons. And many of the states that are renouncing feel that it is unfair to have this discrimination enshrined for perpetuity. They want to have a treaty which comes up for renewal periodically, perhaps, and where at each point they can say, well, the United States and the other weapon states still have not yet lived up to their obligations to move toward nuclear disarmament, and they want to use this occasion to pressure us to move in this direction. Fortunately, this year, unlike the case in 1990, we have a fantastic story to tell about our movement in the direction of denuclearization. I don't have all the facts and figures in hand, but you just have to remember the START I treaty, the START II treaty moving along, the dismantling and pulling back of all of our tactical nuclear weapons, except I think 10% in Europe, and the Russians sort of following the lead. Dismantling occurring in, at a rate of 2,000 warheads per year in both countries. And the list goes on. And this year, I think we can really say that we are meeting our Article 6 obligations, that's the article of the treaty, and are really moving forward to operate in good faith in negotiating toward an end of the nuclear arms race. In fact, the U.S. position is the nuclear arms race is over, in fact. At the conference, we will face challenges principally from the non-aligned movement, led by Indonesia, with Nigeria, Iran, Mexico in the van as well. And I'm sure we'll be debating this a little later on. I have a feeling that the issue, we have done a lot toward moving toward nuclear disarmament. We're supporting a comprehensive test ban and so forth. And I think now the fight is being waged on other grounds. Will the Mexicans, on whom we're spending $50 billion, come out against us and really fight us in this forum, the $50 billion in the peso bailout area? Will Egypt, which is very concerned about an indefinite treaty that allows Israel to stay outside with nuclear weapons while it's inside, will Egypt pull back from a very tough line that it's taking because of its fear of antagonizing a friend, the United States? Will we be able to go to the Egyptians and say, look, we have so much else on our table, on our plate together, let's move forward and not allow this issue to bring the treaty down and be a black blot on our relationship. And I think we'll be doing this with many of the countries that are very influential in this area. And I would add one country that doesn't get mentioned is South Africa. The African states, by and large, have been pretty true to the non-aligned movement. And Nigeria and South Africa are very influential here. Ironically, South Africa, which has adopted this stance of renouncing nuclear weapons and eliminating its own, has not yet said it will support an indefinite extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And perhaps here is a place where we could exercise some influence as well. The general feeling is that the movement is going in the right direction. We have at least 75 countries that have declared that they support indefinite extension, and we're hoping to get more. The Germans that I spoke with recently have 85 in the indefinite extension camp, which makes it look like we very well may arrive with the majority. That will grow once it's clear we have the majority. And I think a lot of people would be unhappy if we just had 50% plus one. We would like to have more. So I'm sure we'll be discussing that in the questions and answers later. Well, all of these trends are positive. We have these continuing problems of Israel, India, Pakistan, and Iran. But if you just look at the past few years, you have to say, if that's all we had to deal with, individual countries with security concerns and the rest, trying to develop nuclear weapons in some instances, facing pressures from the outside, international treaties that are more forceful than ever before, I think you could say comfortably that we may very well be able to cap proliferation. It's certainly not beyond the possible. And we have had a real run up to now. The trouble is that we have this other truly grave danger that is looming, and it's looming larger and larger, which sort of hangs over all of this, a sort of horrifying black cloud. And this is the possibility that we're going to have a collapse of nuclear controls in Russia. And you're going to see a world flooded with black market fissile material that can be made into nuclear weapons. The numbers are sort of staggering. You've got hundreds of tons of material, on the one hand, in various forms in Russia, predominantly, but also in some of the other former Soviet states. And over here, a country that only needs 100 kilograms, let's say, of plutonium out of hundreds of tons of material versus just maybe 100 kilograms, let's say, for a 10 nuclear weapon arsenal, or maybe 200 kilograms of weapon-grade uranium. And whereas about a year ago, if you had been listening, you would have heard James Woolsey, the then CIA director, say, well, this is a serious problem, but the good news is there has never been a case involving weapon-grade material on the black market. That was true a year ago, but over the summer, we had 3 or 4 episodes which did involve weapon-grade material showing up principally in Germany, although the most serious case was in the Czech Republic, where I think 2 kilograms of weapon-grade uranium was found. So we're seeing a trend. If I had a very positive trend to report at the opening part of my remarks, the trend in this area is very much the opposite way. The nuclear weapons, it seems, are under pretty good control. And I think the general sense in the community is that the military in Russia is very concerned about this issue and very alert to it and making sure to do the right thing with respect to the stuff under its control. And one example that I learned of recently is that when the Russians brought back the tactical nuclear weapons from Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, they were still distributed at 100 different sites in Russia sort of for ready deployment against whatever foes there might be. Recently, the Russians have consolidated these into considerably fewer locations under even better security. And it's a reflection, I think, of the Russian military sensitivity to the issue here, particularly now that we're seeing some problems within the Russian military. But where the big problem seems to be is in the nuclear production establishment, the weapons production complex, where you have the organization MINATOM, the Ministry of Atomic Energy, where the sense is there is a sort of ambivalence about just how aggressive they want to be in terms of imposing new controls. There's a sense that perhaps just like our own Department of Energy in years past, I'm all right, Jack. Everything is all right. They're not serious problems. These little things that we're seeing on the black market are some people say in Russia that they've been set up by the West to embarrass Russia. You have a sense that they're reluctant sometimes to accept American assistance and to allow us to work with them to improve controls. And I think this remains a very serious area, although considerable funding is being provided to work the issue. There is a sense that the existing security at these facilities, these are the MINATOM facilities and also at a lot of independent research laboratories, are really not up to snuff, and they are vulnerable. And some of the material we're seeing on the black market is coming not necessarily from where the weapons are manufactured or taken apart, but from other locations where research is done with these materials and where there has been a lot of laxity. Another danger area where I gather the Russians have now come around and are more concerned is the nuclear fuel cycle for nuclear submarines. Submarines use, in some cases, part of the core is weapon-grade material, and it's not always treated as though it's weapon-grade material within Russia, and we think some of the black market material may be coming from this source as well. The Navy has recently indicated, the Russian Navy, that it wants to work with our nuclear labs to improve the situation. But certainly the problem is growing, and we even have an element of the problem here in the United States where a Congress, even under the Democrats, was showing reluctance in terms of funding some of the programs to assist the Russians with their improving controls and so forth. That's going to get worse, I think, with a Republican Congress that is very chary about foreign aid. And we've even heard the new problem that the Russians are selling a reactor to Iran, therefore we shouldn't give them any assistance at all, which Newt Gingrich has raised. So I think here is a very serious problem over there, and our ability to work the problem, even though it's limited, may be more restricted if we lose support for the kind of things we've been doing with the Russians in our Congress and can't get money through the system. Well, let me just close with a couple of thoughts about what as individual citizens and scholars and opinion makers can do here. You'll recall that I said Indonesia was the leading element of the non-aligned movement, which is resisting indefinite extension of the NPT. So perhaps the first thing we can all do is take an Indonesian to lunch and try to persuade them of the importance of this and the fact that they're going to be very influential. I think more seriously, it's hard to certainly the American public has no influence on the Indonesian decision-making. And it's not even clear that the American government has a lot. It's not one of those countries with whom we have tight relations and you can sort of build on those. But we do have influence with other countries, and one country where the American public has influence is with South Africa. And I think if it became known that within the American community, and I hope I'm speaking for everyone on the dais, I imagine I am, that there is support for indefinite extension and that we want to see South Africa do its part and really confirm that it's absolutely, totally committed to nuclear non-proliferation. It seems to me that this isn't a government with whom American popular opinion does have some influence, and perhaps there's work to be done there. Finally, I think we all must keep pressure on the United States to maintain the momentum for arms control, which it has demonstrated so far. I don't think there's much risk of backsliding, but you have a Congress with a different orientation from the administration. And finally, I think we have to press for continued funding of the non-Lugar program and the other elements of American assistance to Russia to help deal with that part of the nuclear danger. So there's a big agenda here, both for the officials of the U.S. government and for scholars and citizens like ourselves. Thank you.
Thank Sandy for a very excellent tour of the horizon and for putting it succinctly and to the point. And I think that this will give us a basis after Randy's comments for some conversation and discussion. We're very pleased to have, as the second member of the panel tonight, local Randy Forsberg. Randy's the director of the Institute for Defense and Disarmament Studies, which is a Cambridge-based nonprofit research center, which she founded in 1979. They publish, among other things, the Arms Control Reporter. Randy began working at SIPRI in Stockholm at the International Peace Research Institute back in 1968. It's hard enough to remember, where she authored the SIPRI yearbook for almost a decade on surveying parts of it for surveying strategic weapons. In the early 80s, Randy drafted the proposal for a bilateral freeze on testing, a rather crazy idea at the time, as it was regarded by many people, to freeze the testing, production, and deployment of nuclear weapons, something that has subsequently, after too many years, been accepted. And she helped found and lead the National Nuclear Weapons Freeze Campaign. Recipient of the MacArthur Foundation Fellowship, she's currently studying the links between the spread of democratic values and declining tolerance for the use of force. She's also been working on a cooperative approach to security, which focuses on confidence-building measures, arms control, and multilateral peacekeeping. She's recently been involved in a multi-year study of international restraints on arms development, production, and trade, undertaken jointly by a number of scholars in the main arms-producing nations. The first of these reports is a CSIA study called Arms Production Dilemmas, which was published in November, and a second volume, which CSIA will also publish this fall, is called Arms Control in the New Era. Finally, and most recently, Randy has co-authored a book called A Non-Proliferation Primer, which is a concise introduction and handy reference source, which will be published by the MIT Press on the opening day of the NPT Review Conference in April. And there's some flyers for the book at the door where you might be able to get a discount if you like it. So thank you, Randy.
Thanks very much. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to discuss what Americans can do, if anything, to stop the spread of nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction more generally. I'm a bit intimidated by being on a panel with Sandy Spector, who is probably the leading expert in the country on this subject, and I think he certainly did a fabulous job of giving us an overview of the salient things one needs to know to think about the near-term prospects. And in a sense, rather than try to supplement or dispute any of those points, I'm going to complement them, as I would put it, by taking a somewhat longer-term perspective and looking at the prospects for nuclear proliferation, not just in the next 2 or 3 or 5 years, but in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. It seems to me that our goal, the U.S. policy goal and the goal of citizens everywhere, should be to try to make nuclear weapons irrelevant, to make their use unthinkable, to sort of have them move into the category, the way I think about it is the category that we now, the way we now think about biological weapons as really not weapons. I mean, something that's so uncontrollable, whose effects are so pervasive and uncontrollable that they are simply not considered useful as weapons, but more just a sort of dangerous catastrophe. So the question I ask myself in thinking about nuclear proliferation over the longer term is what steps would have to be taken in order to lead to that goal, to have the entire international community and the leaders of countries that we now think of as nuclear threshold or near nuclear or potential proliferators really just not be interested in acquiring nuclear weapons. It seems to me that the United States, Russia, and to a lesser extent Britain, France, and China really do need to do a great deal more than the kinds of steps that have been outlined so far in order for the world's perception of the role of nuclear weapons in international affairs to move in the direction I described. In fact, throughout Sandy's talk, I was sitting and wondering, I was wishing he would say exactly why, and I'm sure he'll come back later and do so, why indefinite extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is something that's so important and that Americans in particular should support and be urging and trying to accomplish, when, for my part, it's really very hard for me to see what kinds of incentives or pressures might be brought to bear on the United States and Russia in particular to move in the direction of making nuclear weapons irrelevant, if not a series or a limited duration or a series of successive extension conferences, each of which sort of punctuate the history with an accounting, holding the great powers accountable for their part, or holding the nuclear powers accountable. What have you done? What is your own, those countries which had nuclear weapons at the outset of the treaty, what have you done to move in the direction of making nuclear weapons irrelevant to the conduct of international affairs that warrants the rest of us treating them as though they were? So I don't think we can say that the panel fully agreed on this point, but I do think it's something certainly we'll all want to go over in the discussion period and certainly hear Sandy's comments on further. In the shorter term, before I come back to these long-term change options, in the shorter term, I think even to say that the United States and Russia have lived up to their obligation under Article 6 to take steps to reverse the arms race is being generous, if not exaggerating and overstating the case, in a couple of senses. First of all, the steps that have been taken clearly were not taken in a sort of deliberate way as steps to reverse the nuclear arms race because a judgment was made that the nuclear arms race was bad, but rather in the context of the end of the Cold War, the dissolution of the Warsaw Pact and the former Soviet Union. These steps certainly had nothing to do with the Non-Proliferation Treaty per se, or with making a choice to sort of convey that nuclear weapons were not important in deterring conventional non-nuclear warfare, in coercion, in the conduct of international affairs, but rather merely that with one major conventional war prospect, the prospect of an East-West war in Europe gone, those nuclear weapons which had been relevant to deterring that war could be pulled back. So I think these steps which have been taken in the wake of the Cold War, of the START Treaty, the cuts in strategic forces, and also the pulling back of tactical nuclear weapons, all steps which I think are marvelous and extremely important. Let me just insert in parenthesis that for 20 years, while I was working in this field, and until George Bush made a little noted announcement that tactical nuclear weapons were being pulled off of ships and then later pulled back from Europe completely, I just thought that it was the height of insanity that there were some 30,000 nuclear weapons on short-range delivery vehicles scattered around Europe and throughout the navies of the United States and Russia and in the Far East as a nuclear tripwire, specifically to make sure that any conventional war would escalate to nuclear war. So I think that change alone has been momentous and extremely important. But if we look at the kinds of changes that the non-nuclear countries have been looking to the nuclear countries for, they are in areas where changes have not yet been made. A comprehensive test ban treaty, no more tests of nuclear weapons by the current nuclear powers, no more development of new types of nuclear weapons, a cutoff in the production of fissile material. Why are we producing more fissile material if we're dismantling our arsenals? Why are we unwilling to have a cutoff? The United States, in fact, is still producing one new type of nuclear weapon, the Trident II missile warhead, which is a counterforce warhead, which has extremely high accuracy and could be used, was designed for use against military targets in a nuclear warfighting type of capability. This weapon system is still in production and being backfitted while older missiles or warheads are pulled off. It's being backfitted in the Trident submarines today and will be for a number of years to come. Going a little bit further than the past set of claims, if we look more to the future, in addition to a comprehensive test ban and a cutoff in the production of fissile material, and a halt to the production of nuclear weapon systems, what we need to be looking for, and this I think is relevant to the new threat from the breakup of the Soviet Union, is for the huge stocks of plutonium and enriched uranium that exist in the United States and Russia, and indeed the tactical nuclear weapons and strategic weapons that have been withdrawn, not merely to be stored for potential future use in new nuclear weapons, but to be accounted for publicly, the warheads and bombs dismantled, the nuclear material taken out, and that material turned over for, I would say use in nuclear power plants. I'm sure many people here don't agree with that, but basically made incapable of incorporation in nuclear weapons, so that along with the reduction in delivery vehicles, there is a commensurate reduction in the amount of bombs and bomb-grade material that's in the inventory and in the hands of the great powers, so that sort of what you see on the outside is what you get in terms of their actual nuclear potential. Now, if you ask yourself the question, why have they been reluctant to agree to a comprehensive test ban and a cutoff of fissile material? Why hasn't production stopped? Why haven't these stockpiles been publicly accounted and a process of their dismantling been undertaken? The only answer I can come up with is that they do. The leaders, the political and military leaders of the United States and Russia do, in fact, still set great store by their nuclear weaponry, their nuclear arsenal, their nuclear capability, the intimidation, the coercion, the deterrence, whatever the qualities may be that one person or another puts the highest premium on. So I think that this example clearly does bear on the longer-term prospects of proliferation. This bad example, I would say, or let's say mixed example, given that there have been many very important steps of progress in the last 5 years, but also many weaknesses. In addition to changes in their own nuclear programs that make clear that they themselves no longer rely or plan to rely on nuclear weapons as a sort of supplementary instrument of politics behind conventional military forces. There are two other major steps that I think the nuclear powers, the great powers, could take to leave no stone unturned in the process of trying to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons over the longer term. The first is to look in a less partisan and more cooperative or shared way at the causes and potential resolution of regional conflicts. And I'm thinking specifically not so much of the political causes or cultural causes, but rather the military relationships in the Middle East, in South Asia, in East Asia, and over the much longer term, even in Europe itself, where things are, of course, very quiet right now. There are changes that might be made in threats of conventional warfare, which very clearly have been tied to the regions and the specific countries that have already acquired a nuclear weapon capability or are the highest likelihood candidates for doing so. Two kinds of measures come to mind. One is far more effective use of the United Nations, of collective security, of security guarantees, where, of course, since 1990, the world has been moving in the opposite direction, in part because of confusion over the role of the UN in internal conflicts and civil wars. Somehow the idea that the UN could play a useful role in the way it was originally intended, that is, in being prepared to act in the case of international aggression in support of the attacked country. That role of the UN, which could now be implemented now that the Cold War is over in a way that it couldn't for 45 years, somehow seems to have just fallen by the wayside and not be considered at all. It seems to me that for the United States, Russia, the largest European countries, and some of the largest developing countries, such as India and Egypt and Brazil, along with Japan and China, if these, the world's largest countries, were to sort of sit down and plan out some sort of cooperative military action to defend victim countries against acts of international aggression, this would serve to build a sense of community and common values and to prevent a deterioration of relations among these countries at the same time as it would reduce the incentives for the acquisition of sophisticated conventional weaponry and ultimately nuclear weaponry on the part of the largest, wealthiest countries in regions of conflict. Finally, there are also changes that could be made in the conventional non-nuclear military postures of countries involved in regional conflict, and indeed of Russia, Germany, China, even the United States, which would be of a confidence-building nature. There are methods of providing for national defense which rely on the old military adage that the best defense is a good offense. And there are other methods of providing for defense which are more narrowly defensive in nature. The problem with having offensive defenses is that they undermine confidence, they perpetuate mistrust, and images of a potential opponent as a military opponent. So if there were controls on the arms trade and regional arms reductions which moved in the direction of strengthening defensive military structures and weakening offensive military structures, let's say as between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or Iraq if it's ever out from under the UN, or India and Pakistan, even the two Koreas, although that's a very tough example. These changes, reductions in offensive capability and strengthening of defensive capability, could help build confidence in the conventional peace, reduce fears of attack, and thereby eliminate some of the underlying incentives for the acquisition of nuclear weapons, which are clearly at play in Israel and to a very great extent in India and Pakistan. In sum, all of the measures that I've described as potential measures that could be undertaken or fostered by this country in order to do our best to make sure that nuclear weapons don't spread, all of these measures have to do with getting rid of the incentives for countries to acquire nuclear weapons, getting rid of the incentive of wanting to sort of have mirror image behavior to match in terms of prestige and appearance of power, the sort of cloak of mantle of power, the five nuclear powers the five acknowledged nuclear powers who are also at the moment the only permanent members of the Security Council, and sort of give this aura that having nuclear weapons gives you something a little extra that people do indeed want to have. So getting rid of that sort of prestige and power incentive, getting rid of the regional conflict incentive, and getting rid of this sort of paternalism of do as we say, not as we do, are all things that I think would be helpful over the longer term. Thank you.
Thank Randy very much for an excellent complementary view, which did not agree in every respect, which will make a for a more interesting panel. I'm going to make just a short comment with a couple of questions to get us started, and then we're opening the floor for questions where we ask you to line up at one or other of the microphones so that we'll be able to hear your questions. Basically, I just make three quick points, mostly in agreement, but with a little bit of disagreement. First, I think Randy's suggestion that we try to look at the long run back and the long run forward is a very good idea. I began, Sandy, recalling John Kennedy's prediction in 1963 that by the end of the 70s there would be 25 nuclear weapon states, and asking that we ask, why that was not an unreasonable prediction at the time, but why it was falsified. If we look back at this history, actually since about 1950, about every 5 years, there's been one more nuclear weapon state. So you do Soviet Union, then England, then France, then China, then Israel, then India, then Pakistan, then South Africa in and out, as Sandy pointed out, then Iraq a year or a year and a half away. So if I look at this story, is this the story about every 5 years, and so we're not doing too much worse and we're not doing too much better, or something changed? Second point. As to the NPT and its extension in the conference that begins in April, I would hazard a guess that, my own personal guess, that the NPT will win unlimited, unconditional extension by a majority. I think actually by a substantial majority, not a consensus, but by a substantial majority. And I think the reasons why will be many, and this in part differs, I think, slightly from Randy, in part because it's reasonable given what the haves have done relative to the have-nots, but in part because the reasons that lead many of the states to take the action of supporting unlimited, unconditional surrender don't have so much to do with a strategist's analysis of what's reasonable or what's fair or what's required with respect to nuclear weapons, but with the reasons why states do things in international affairs, which include their opportunities for economic assistance or their relationships with other parties, or the security guarantees that they get, or the security guarantees that they don't, or threats, or so forth. But I, again, agree or disagree with the bet that there will be unconditional, unlimited surrender. And the third point, as we think about proliferation, there's a temptation to think of it almost like it was either you have nuclear weapons or you don't have nuclear weapons, and that's the only bright line. Now, both of you have written about the fact that actually that's not the only interesting bright line, that if you take the path, or in effect the mobilization timetable to a nuclear arsenal of any particular proportion, you can then ask at what station along this path is any particular state at any particular point in time. And part of the success of the non-proliferation effort of late, I would say, has been stopping people from going over that last threshold. The Indians actually went across it and called it a peaceful nuclear explosive and then retreated back a little bit. The Israelis have a nuclear weapons capability, but they don't acknowledge it and so call it ambiguous and propose that that's slightly better. A number of other states have what I would think of as standby capabilities, in the sense that if for whatever reasons they needed nuclear weapons, a year later all of a sudden one would discover that they had nuclear weapons. I think a lot of security for the world comes from the fact that they stand on this side of the line rather than the other. But I still think that's an issue as we're trying to portray the whole picture, so I'd be interested in comments on that. But with those three comments, I'll turn back to the panel and see if you all have comments on those or each other's comments, and then we'll open the floor.
I'm going to leave it to you. I've made my comments.
All right. Well, I think the basic question that was framed in Randy's remarks is a very important one, and it deserves a little bit more examination. I felt obliged to sort of cover an awful lot of ground. It didn't do justice to this particular question as to whether it is wise and desirable for a country like South Africa or Chile or Indonesia to support indefinite extension of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I sort of agree with Graham that these countries will make those decisions on the basis of a spectrum of issues. One part of the spectrum, however, will be their specific security concerns. And they're going to look around and ask themselves whether their security is enhanced in a world where only 5 countries are allowed to have the bomb and everyone else is pretty well frozen, especially everyone else in their respective neighborhoods, under a treaty that's permanent and that is sort of blessed by the international community, or whether they're better off in a situation where they can have every 5 or 10 or 15 years or 25 years a chance to take a pot shot at the nuclear powers, but where the status of the treaty in their region is more uncertain because it's always going to be reopened. Now, I have a feeling in the end, there are not that many countries that are going even to decide on security grounds. It will be the larger political issues. But I think for many states, there really is a security benefit in having this treaty enshrined and made permanent. Some countries, let's just take the case of Egypt, is the one where Egypt has complained that Israel is outside the treaty and has nuclear weapons. Why should Egypt accept this as a permanent situation? Well, one reason is that Israel and Egypt have a peace treaty. Israeli nuclear weapons are not targeted on Cairo. They're targeted on other threats, whereas the genuine threats to Egypt are from Iran and from Libya. I mean, Iran right now is trying to destabilize the Egyptian government, and the Libyans and the Egyptians have been squabbling for years. The treaty, if it's made permanent, will keep a lid, to a certain degree at least, on the Iranian and Libyan nuclear programs. So that's not precisely the trade-off that Randy was describing. It's a different trade-off, but it's a country who, if it looks at its security concerns in a sort of pure and simple, may well come out and say that the treaty really has a security benefit if made permanent, and I think many other countries are in a similar situation. I mean, here the entire African continent is about to enter into a nuclear weapon-free zone, so clearly they all know that they want to be denuclearized. This includes the northern states north of the Sahara, even Egypt. Why would they want to sort of undercut that very step by raising questions about the NPT? I don't know. And the Latin American states are also locked into permanent denuclearization under the Treaty of Tlatelolco. So I think they're going to come around. The other part of Randy's comments where I think one needs to reply is I don't think she really did justice to the extraordinary turn of events in the major nuclear powers. We have stopped producing fissile material. The president has agreed to put 200 tons under sort of permanent sequestration, so it will never be used again for nuclear weapons. The Russians are giving up 500 tons of material to use in nuclear power plants. That's the stuff we're buying. So you're really seeing a trend which in many ways reflects the very types of things that you're pressing for, but the vehicle hasn't been the NPT. The vehicle has been sort of a bilateral vision of the United States and Russia about what they want to see in the future. We have initiated and support a global ban on the further production of nuclear weapons material for nuclear weapons. So, we're not reluctant in this area. We're in the forefront. And the same is true for a comprehensive test ban. So I think the days when you can say the United States is the one that's dragging its feet and is really causing a slowdown in what would otherwise be momentum toward denuclearization, I think those days are really past. And the real question here is, if you're not quite satisfied with how far the major powers, the nuclear powers, are going on that front, is that a reason to sort of make trouble over here in a treaty that has so much utility in dealing with another part of the nuclear problem? And I guess I make the trade-off that it is better to have the non-proliferation part of the treaty confirmed and solidified and made permanent, even if you sort of lose a chance, perhaps, to put a little extra pressure on the nuclear weapon states. Every 5 years, a new nuclear power? Maybe. I think I've seen that chart, but the trend line at least is going down now in some of these cases with the reversal in South Africa and the developments in Ukraine. And I think in some respects you have to look at the larger trends as to what led to this. And it's not clear precisely whether we're going to see additional states taking this stance. I think, at least if North Korea and Ukraine are examples, countries are seeing their futures in terms of economic integration with the West and avoidance of isolation, and they're seeing nuclear weapons as less relevant. And I think they're asking themselves, would they rather have nuclear weapons today or have a currency like the yen? And I think they are more and more opting for economic achievements. There are these other states out there, Japan and Germany in particular, that have what might be considered standby capabilities. But if you speak to many Germans and Japanese, they believe that the non-nuclear culture now has been so deeply enshrined in those societies that these civilian capabilities with this potential for weapons is really more innocent than Graham allows. I have sort of waffled on that issue. I sort of sometimes feel it is a dangerous capability. I wish it was reduced, and I think we can move in that direction. But I think it's not sort of the most urgent part of the danger that we're confronting, and what is really is this possibility of material floating around the black market that could allow countries to accelerate their nuclear programs.
If you would say your name before you put in your question, because this is recorded for public radio, please.
George Ellsworth, I'm chair of Greater Boston Physicians for Social Responsibility. On the, for years, I had one quick response to your comments, Professor Allison, and then one question for Dr. Spector. The response concerns who compromises when. It seems that you're encouraging us to extend into the international realm, something we're seeing happening in the national realm now. That is that people who are progressive are encouraged to compromise their positions in the name of achieving at least some sort of compromise or getting something, whereas people at the conservative end of the spectrum are being encouraged not to compromise at all. With respect to the NPT, strangely enough, the battle is that the unlimited extension is the conservative position, and the limited extension is the more progressive position, as seen, at least as outlined by Dr. Forsberg and as seen by many organizations working on this. I guess I have to wonder why we should lead with the compromise, or be encouraged to lead with the compromise instead of be encouraged to lead with the principled position, which is that we have to work to make these weapons seen as really undesirable and unusable and unownable, as Dr. Forsberg is encouraging us. The question, I guess, I see Dr. Spector's disagreeing, so hear his response to that. And I guess the question is, in the Middle East, for instance, the implications seem to be pressure should and will be brought to bear, well, not only in the Middle East, but across the world. Economic pressure will be brought to bear by the United States on countries to knuckle under at the NPT. And for those of you who were involved in the CTB Amendment Conference at the UN in '91 saw that same process. In the Middle East, this means the United States should bring pressure to bear on Egypt. And I guess the question is, what about bringing pressure to bear and providing security guarantees for Israel so that it could be encouraged as part of this process to give up its nuclear weapons?
Well, let me just restate why I sort of shook my head at your earlier comment. I mean, I believe this government, the Clinton administration, and it's fairly bipartisan, is sincerely committed to this down ramp in terms of where nuclear weapons stand in terms of numbers, in terms of utility, in terms of dismantling warheads, which is not required by any treaty. I mean, that is going on actively, and it's happening also in Russia. And in terms of, as I say, sequestering material, so it will never again be available for nuclear weapons. So you really don't do justice to the state of play, I think, by suggesting that this administration is being just held in check by the fear of what might occur at the NPT Extension Conference. It is committed, I believe, to many, many of the initiatives that you are propounding. Not everyone, but the direction is not antagonistic to where you're headed. And even conservatives can say, gosh, a world with no nuclear weapons would leave the United States in the catbird seat. We ought to do that just for that reason. So I think you're not really being fair to really what's been accomplished here. Now, your second point, just to... Well, I would hate to see us literally apply economic pressure to Egypt. I think what you want to do, in a sense, to Egypt is say, look, this is a very complicated situation. We realize your conflicting objectives. You have a problem with Israel on the one hand, you have a problem with other neighbors, however, you should be recognizing on the other hand. You have stated your principle. We respect that. And if you want to vote against indefinite extension, you won't suffer any consequences. But please don't lobby. Just make this your principled position and let us work with our other colleagues. That is to say with the other Arab states to address, let them address their situation on the merits of their security environment. And I think Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and others will say, gee, Iran is our big threat. The treaty serves our interests. And, we also recognize the Israeli issue, but first and foremost, let's look at Iran. So I agree we want to, we have friends out there that you don't want to arm twist. You want to encourage and cajole and try to reach a modus vivendi. As far as Israel is concerned, it seems to me that the recent American administrations have arm twisted, not on this issue. They have arm twisted on the issue of the peace settlement in the region. And they have pressured Israel to restrain itself in terms of where it builds settlements, in terms of engaging with the Palestinians and with the Syrians and so forth. And in some ways, the United States has to pick and choose a little bit where it does battle. And I think a lot of people feel, and in a way this goes to Randy, another point Randy made, that the way to really achieve a denuclearized weapon of mass destruction free Middle East is to get the peace process in place first. Let's hope Israel doesn't do anything more along these lines. And I think that we've kept in check, even though it's just a very limited check in terms of no testing and no declarations. But we have not shrunk from pressuring this ally of ours, but we have chose to pressure them in a different zone rather than on the nuclear front.
David Wiley with the Lawyers Alliance for World Security. I'd be interested in hearing something about the International Atomic Energy Commission in terms of its constituency, how it's made up, where it gets its powers. Is it solely a creature of the treaty? Does it have powers and responsibilities otherwise? How is it funded? What's the attitude of the non-nuclear nations toward it? Do they have any view that it's dominated by the nuclear club? What's the attitude of the 104th Congress? As we get the arsenals down lower and verification becomes, in a sense, all the more important to make sure nobody's holding back any, what will be the attitude of the United States toward intrusive inspections? And what does it teach us for international governance and world order under law?
All right, I'll take that one as well. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, is a freestanding multilateral organization with, I think, 110 members based in Vienna. It's affiliated with the United Nations, but it's not part of the direct UN structure and does not report up through the UN chain of command. It predates the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The treaty came into force in 1970, and the IAEA was created in 1957. And after its creation, it began to do inspections in various countries of nuclear facilities that had been imported really from other states. And it was a way of guaranteeing that imported material was not misused. Then the treaty came along, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and under the treaty, the agency was given this much bigger responsibility of guaranteeing for each non-nuclear weapon state member that all of its nuclear activities were not being diverted for military purposes. And I would imagine that 95 or 96% of all the inspections conducted by the International Atomic Energy Agency today are to verify compliance with this part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But they do play a role in India. There are a number of facilities there which are under inspection, even though other parts of the Indian nuclear fuel cycle are not, also in Israel and in Pakistan. So it does have a life separate from the treaty. Who dominates this organization? I would say this varies. There have been times at which irate states have been very concerned about certain issues and have gotten their way despite the best effort of the United States to stop them. This was true after Israel bombed the Osirak reactor, for example. There were some sanctions imposed against Israel, as I remember. As a rule, though, it's a multilateral organization. The larger states tend to have more influence. And I think where we've been successful recently is getting a fairly decent consensus on some of the major questions, such as the need for special inspections in North Korea, where we had a consensus. I guess there's also a board structure where we have rotating members, and I believe the United States and Russia and perhaps China are permanent members there as well. As far as funding is concerned in the U.S. Congress, this has always been an issue. The obligations of the agency are growing substantially year by year. It now has to start inspecting in Argentina and Brazil, and in some parts of South Africa where it never inspected before, in Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. So there are all kinds of new obligations it has, and the funding has not always kept up. Regrettably, this is always treated as part of the foreign policy budget, and it comes into all of the headaches that you get of getting the foreign aid bill through Congress. In contrast to perhaps the non-Lugar money that goes through the defense bill and is a little bit easier. So there has always been a funding problem. I think the safeguards budget is about, I think it's about $30 million a year, so it's quite limited, the inspection budget. So I hope that covers some of the background.
Randy wants to make a quick comment.
Yeah, this actually isn't about the IAA, but back to the indefinite extension. I realize there are people waiting, and this will be brief. I've been mulling over what Sandy said about it's a kind of don't let the best be the enemy of the good. I'm afraid I still don't really get the point. I've been thinking about the countries which oppose indefinite extension, which are, among others, Mexico, Brazil, South Africa, Egypt, and the other Arab countries in a group, and India. All countries which oppose indefinite extension on principle, that this is a discriminatory regime where the third world countries and the non-aligned movement in general are being asked to sort of hold to standards that the great powers are not applying to themselves. And I think the strength of that position lies in the fact that in the area of nuclear weapons, as opposed to, let's say, economic issues or even issues of conventional military power, you would think that if there was any area where the great powers could afford to be forthcoming, because they don't stand to lose anything that's going to make their lives worse, this would be the area. And I'm trying to understand how, if Mexico and Brazil in this area of Latin America where there doesn't seem to be any danger of nuclear proliferation, why it would be in their interest not to have a process come up 25 years from today, just like the one that's going on right now. Having a periodic renewal rather than an indefinite extension doesn't mean that the treaty dissolves or that it wouldn't be renewed, just as it's going to be renewed right now. The question isn't whether it's going to be renewed and we will have a non-proliferation treaty. The only question is whether there will be a kind of periodic accounting of how countries are living up to the terms of this treaty. So I hope I could be forgiven to put the question back to Sandy again to tell me what we're going to lose if we have another review like this 25 years from now.
Yes. What you really lose is you either have an unqualified embrace of this treaty as a very, very desirable norm for the world, a sense that the whole globe supports non-proliferation, holding the further rise of additional nuclear weapon states in check, or a more sort of a provisional embrace of the treaty. Now, there are a couple of options out there, and a rolling 25-year extension, where after 25 years the treaty is automatically renewed unless there's a vote against it. Now, that's almost like indefinite extension. I can see the point. Then you get, and I would say, if you had an absolute you wanted to be Solomonic about this and balance everybody's interests just perfectly, you might say, all right, that's the perfect solution. The difficulty is once you begin to open the door to intermediate solutions, other intermediate solutions creep in, like 5-year rolling extensions, where every 5 years there's a question, let's say, about the future of the treaty. Now, perhaps you wouldn't, you wouldn't support that. No. But we also have this difficult problem of managing a multilateral conference with 100 and God knows how many, 172 if everybody shows up, people in a room over a month's time, and that is very, very difficult. And that is why the United States, it's another contributing factor to why we have adhered to a a unified vision of what we would like to accomplish. It's sort of simple. It really bangs the drum for the treaty and shows unquestioned support for it. And at the same time, we are making the arguments that I tried to make, which is to say that we have been living up to Article 6 and really moving in the right direction. So there are many factors here.
I'm going to have to try to do short questions and short answers because we got a number of questions up, and this gentleman, I think, was next.
Hi, my name's Sean Samuel, and I'm an undergrad at Harvard College. My question had to do with the unconditional extension of the NPT that you suggested. I just wanted to make two basic points. The first was, you just mentioned the NPT is something that's highly desirable, but most countries seem to see that really as only an intermediate step to hopefully a comprehensive test ban and eventual denuclearization of all the nuclear weapon states. The problem is that an unconditional extension creates no pressure to further head towards Article 6 for the nuclear weapon states. I mean, most of the IAEA conferences have already ended with most countries complaining about the nuclear weapon states having not progressed very far towards Article 6. And moreover, you mentioned that the NPT creates a lot of safeguards, but most of the safeguards have to do with investigating the building of nuclear plants, and with the amount of fissile material available in Russia right now, which is very loosely guarded, isn't that also extremely dangerous? I'd like to see how you address that point.
I think I've really addressed the substance of the first part of your comment at length. I think you will observe that most countries do not merely see this treaty as a stepping stone, that they are going to vote for indefinite extension. So I think for the reasons I've cited. As far as the Russia threat goes, you're absolutely right. This treaty does not address that threat, and in fact, it will be totally undermined. What good are all these inspections of a nuclear plant in Iran someplace if there's weapons-grade material available in Kazakhstan for the Iranians to purchase that would never show up on an IAEA inventory? And that's why, I would just, in reply to your comment, I would say, let's deal with the part of the problem we can deal with, the traditional threat, using the traditional tools, and we'll have to deal with this new threat, which is very serious, by other means, principally by interacting with the Russians.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Lee Miller, an intern at CSIA. Mr. Spector, I talked with you last fall about the non-aligned movement opposition.
A little closer to the microphone, please.
Sorry. About the non-aligned movement opposition to indefinite extension, and you, along with many others in the NGO community, agreed that indefinite renewal was shaky at best. And today you sounded more positive. And also Director Allison agreed with this. I was wondering if you thought the U.S. strategy over this last few months about constantly building enthusiasm, constantly lobbying heads of state through State Department officials, had a strong effect on this change of feeling about indefinite renewal.
I think we have kind of gone into high gear recently, and it is starting to have an effect. And I think there is a certain sense that I know Ash Carter and others, Assistant Secretary of Defense Ash Carter has invoked, which is that countries may regret if they fail to vote the right way. They'll regret that they didn't have a chance to participate in this historic occasion in some ways. So I think there's lots going on. There is a momentum is building. We have the CSCE, the Pacific Forum, a number of other blocks of states that are supporting indefinite extension, NATO and so on. And I think we're going to get one or two extra blocks so that by the time we arrive at the conference, the majority will be there and it will be evident.
Victor Bass from the Lawyers Alliance for World Security. I guess it's natural with the Treaty Extension Conference coming up next month to be focusing on the voting units that will be participating, namely the nations of the world, but I'm a little surprised not to hear the panel discussing the problem of non-national proliferation. Is there anything you can tell us about what is being done or can be done about the problem of units, groups, organizations, entities, or individuals other than the nations of the world getting their hands on some of the material that's maybe disappearing from the former Soviet states?
Well, I think Sandy has offered a view before about that, which I think is correct, which is that I've stated it in a different context. I think that 90% of the problem is the residue of 30 or 40,000 nuclear weapons and the equivalent fissile material in the former Soviet Union. About that, the Non-Proliferation Treaty is silent. It's just not about that. And about that, the international community's efforts, I would give it about a D+. Okay? D+. Yeah.
Yes, my name is Corey Bellong Sylvester, and I'm a graduate student at MIT. This is sort of a historical question on the NPT. I think in theory, and I'm sure everyone in this room would agree that we are in full support of the goals of entire global denuclearization. No one wants to see a warhead go off. But the practical realities of it are, how important, in your opinion, has the NPT been and will continue to be? We have this, you gave at the beginning of your talk, Dr. Spector, on 9 countries that had turned away from nuclear development, but it seems to me those are 9 examples where we had a treaty in place that virtually had no effect on any of those countries' individual decisions, in my mind. And if you could, and whether this treaty is renewed for how long or not, I think, in my mind, will have no effect on the way the world, the countries of this world make decisions based on the experience we've had with Israel in non-signatory countries. I really doubt that this weighs into their national decision making. And given that, is Article 6 very realistic in the sense that the nuclear powers should strive towards entire denuclearization given India, Pakistan, and Israel? And is it even desirable?
Well, I mean, you raised a really interesting and really important set of issues, because I would say if you go and look at all of these countries and try to distill principles as to what leads countries to abandon nuclear weapons or to accept restraint, I think in every case you will find that the presence of the NPT was a factor. That is to say that these countries appreciated they were going against the grain, and the grain was embodied in this treaty with so many international participants, and that in some instances, actual behavior could be affected because we could invoke the treaty. In North Korea is the case. You signed the treaty, that means you promised to have inspections. You don't want the inspections, we're going to the UN. And the very fact that we did it in that instance, I think is going to have an impact on future cases like Iran. So just to be very brief, there are going to be 6 or 7 issues relevant to each country's decision, let's say. But in the background, and sometimes in the foreground, is this international norm out there, which either they are going against or they're embracing, and they have to weigh that. It's a cost factor that's part of the decision making. I did allude to some other factors, and there's a big debate on this very issue, by the way, which I have a piece in Survival that talks about some of these larger trends, whether democratization and desire to be integrated into the Western economy are the positive trends. There are others who argue that the end of the Cold War is a trend that's propelling countries toward more nuclearization. So you've put your finger on an area which is very much in debate right now.
Gentleman here.
My name is Karthik Chandramali. I'm a first-year MPP student at the Kennedy School. I'd just like to make a quick comment about Professor Spector's argument that without indefinite extension of the treaty, that we would have only a provisional embrace of the non-nuclear norm. And I think that we already have that embrace. We're talking about evaluating our nuclear doctrines in the United States, changing to perhaps a no first use doctrine or a defense of last resort doctrine, or adopting counterpower targeting, and at the same time, which all implicitly legitimate the use of nuclear weapons. And at the same time, we're doing research at Los Alamos on micro and mini nukes for deployment in low intensity conflicts. And also that UN Security Council membership is somewhat predicated. I mean, the perception is that it's predicated upon possession of nuclear weapons. So I think we already have that provisional norm. And in light of that, I would hope that both panelists, or all three, would speak to the fact that, perhaps we need to talk about some of the psychology that guides the Non-Proliferation Treaty. I mean, are we going to deal with the guns butter trade-off that exists in the developing world in some of these regional conflicts? Or are we going to coerce people into accepting this norm for 25 years or indefinitely, but at the same time, gut it? I mean, it seems like we demystify the norm by saying you have to sign on to the NPT forever for economic considerations, but then we don't speak to those economic considerations in terms of development and security, those linkages.
At the risk of alienating Sandy, I think I've been thinking about the stories I've heard from diplomats at the UN about how the United States coerced the last few countries into endorsing the Gulf War on the Security Council, those countries which had been planning at least to abstain, if not to vote against, so that it could have the appearance of a consensus vote, with, I think, one abstention. And it coerced several countries using economic means, like do this or else. And it was very nasty. And I think that that kind of behavior undermines international norms. It undermines the force of international law and moral norms. And I think for the United States to adopt the position that Ash Carter has expressed here in talks of do this or else you'll be sorry, really is not a good way for the United States to promote this norm. So I sort of agree with the thrust of your question as I understood it.
I'm going to let this gentleman have what will unfortunately be the last question because Sandy is between one airport and the next. Please.
My name is George Samaripa, and I'm a political organizer. And I'd like to ask both panelists to tease apart a word which they've used, and that's the United States. In my opinion, the United States is made up of a government and a Congress, but it also is made up of a popular, we'll call it a popular movement, which on the nuclear issue did create in the 80s a fairly substantial blip on the public radar. So what I would like you to comment on is what you think the influence of public opinion has been in leading up to the present, and then what you might look at the public's influence on where we ought to go. Because it does strike me that there is a difference, at least in time, between what the United States does as a government and what the United States people sometimes desire, at least in the form of movements.
Good. I think that's a good, tough question to end on, and let's see if Randy wants to speak.
I'm going to leave this time to Sandy because I think I've already made my view clear that the public should stand to the left of the government.
Well, the government has just moved to the right of the Congress has just moved to the right of the administration.
That's right.
And I think, those who want to see the government move left will probably be delighted to just see it stay in place and not be pushed to the right. I mean, we're already seeing a problem of inability to get the Chemical Weapons Convention through Congress, which the administration supports and Republican administrations have supported. So I think just completing the current agenda, which I think is an astonishing agenda, will be very important. I guess we all have some different views on these issues. What I think is worth invoking is the fact that you have all these countries that are recently signing up to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, knowing all of its flaws, appreciating that there are still nuclear weapons in the major powers, appreciating that these are still to a certain degree the coin of the realm, but nonetheless feeling that participating in the treaty is worthwhile because it enhances the security of the individual country involved, it demonstrates international good citizenship, or what you like. I mean, here was a country as Argentina, Algeria, Ukraine, Tajikistan, and Chile will sign shortly. I mean, these are all countries that have plenty of choices, they weren't coerced, and they're all moving this way because they see the treaty as advantageous to them and as beneficial to international stability, notwithstanding the flaws that we've been discussing here tonight. So I think you do a disservice, or you mischaracterize, I don't mean just Randy specifically, but some of the comments, mischaracterize the views of foreign governments. Most foreign governments, 167 non-nuclear weapon states out of 179 that are members of the UN, think this is a pretty good treaty, and they embrace it. Now, whether they'll go as far as to make it permanent or not remains to be seen, but they have not, in most cases, had their arms twisted to join this treaty. It is done out of a sense that it's an advantageous treaty to them and good international policy. So I think you sort of misread where countries are perceiving their interests and just how much store they're putting into attempting to influence American nuclear behavior.
Let me, on behalf of the Kennedy School, say our thanks to the Lawyers Alliance for World Security for helping organize this event tonight. I'd say thank you to Sandy Spector and Randy Forsberg for a terrific overview, and we'll all get a chance to stay tuned for the month ahead as the extension of the treaty is debated at the UN. So we say thank you very much.
Well,
Go.
yeah. Well, I got this.
Give you dinner, but you're not.
Say you have having
Oh,
read
good. Oh, thank you.
the years and relied heavily on this,
Good.
and arguing me